Good morning, everyone.
Started, I think. Yeah.
On behalf of the conference presenters, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, and the Lewis and Clark Animal Legal Defense Fund Student Chapter, thank you for joining us this morning, finding this room, and we'll be having a great discussion about the Clinicians panel. My name is Megan Senatori. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Center for Animal Law Studies. And we have a great panel for you this morning. Excuse me, I got to back up a little bit here, with Professor Kim Connolly and Professor Kathy Hessler. It is going to be a very interactive session, so we encourage you to ask questions. When you do that, we want you to come up to the mic so that we can make sure everyone can hear it. And with that, let me introduce our fantastic panelists. So Professor Kim Connolly serves as the Vice Dean for Advocacy and Experiential Learning for the University of Buffalo School of Law, and she directs their clinical legal education program there. In addition to being a lawyer, Professor Connolly received a certification in nonprofit management from Duke University before law school. She recently completed a graduate certificate program in restorative practices, and she received that from the International Institute for Restorative Practices. Professor Connolly teaches, practices, studies, writes, and speaks about environmental and animal law policies, creatively examining and sharing ideas about how to move forward for a sustainable future. So that is Kim. And then Kathy Hessler is the clinical professor at Lewis and Clark Law School, where she is also the director of the animal law clinic there. It's a comprehensive clinic that addresses a wide variety of matters as a training ground for students. And in addition to being a clinical professor there, Professor Hessler has taught clinics at, and it's a long list, Case Western Reserve University School of Law, Cornell Law School, the University of Dayton Law School, the Capital University School of Law, and Georgetown University Law Center. In those clinics, Professor Hessler has worked on a wide variety of issues, including domestic relations, consumer, housing, transactional, public benefits, and other civil matters, which probably encompasses a category this large because she's Kathy Hessler. A little known fact is that Kim is a former student of Kathy's when she was at Georgetown. So with that, we'll kick off the panel. And again, as I said, for those that are just coming in, we invite you to ask questions, but to go to the microphone for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we're here today to talk a little about clinics, but we really do want it to be interactive. We're going to save some time for discussion at the end. But if there's something that, as we're talking, comes up, we want you to feel free to pop up and talk with us about it, because we're a small group, and we're into clinical teaching, so we want to make sure that we're responsive to people who are here. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little about what animal law clinics do, what they are, a description of each of our clinics, just so you get a sense of what we do day to day with our students and our communities. Communities sometimes are writ large. We're going to do a little exercise there because we're clinicians and we do exercises. Then we're going to talk about what happens in terms of learning and deep learning in animal law clinics, talk about a few special issues, and then we're going to end with ways that you might engage with clinics going forward. There's a bunch of you doing different things, so we're really excited to hear about what you think at the end of our time together. So let's talk about clinical legal education. Clinical legal education is one of these things that some people are like, oh yeah. When I talk to some people who've been out of law school for 30 years, they're like, oh yeah, I went to law school before there were clinics. It's like, no, really you didn't. You just may have chosen not to have clinics because we've had people doing things while they're in law school for centuries. In the late 1800s, there were lots of people doing legal dispensaries. Law students were doing things while they were learning. And then as the early 1900s came, scholarship started to say, wow, shouldn't students be doing things to earn credit to learn how to lawyer instead of just learning about the law? So by the mid-1900s, a few law schools allowed these small experiments in applied legal education and kind of created legal clinics. Oftentimes they were in the basement or hidden away, but they still were happening, doing really important things in the community. And then in 1950s, as people started paying attention to what was going on in poverty, there were more law schools that started bringing this out into the open and started having legal clinics that really started to work primarily at that point for the poor and underserved. Then the 60s happened. Lots of attention to social justice issues, slight expansion, slight refocus, slight broadening of clinics. And in 1969, suddenly there was this new entity that said, wow, it's really important that we start using law schools to create access to justice and to create training for people who are going to be lawyers, and started funding things. And so, of course, there were funding that started with this Council on Legal Education for Professional Responsibility, moved to the Ford Foundation, and actually then moved to some larger federal funding that created a lot of opportunities for clinics. And so by 1975, 127 schools had clinics, and some had multiple clinics. Clinic scholarship then emerged. All of a sudden, there were these people who came in. Lots of people joined joined law schools to do clinics, and they weren't really interested in writing things with 500 footnotes about something that happened 200 years ago. They wanted to do really difficult. So all of a sudden, there was this new level of scholarship that started with clinical scholarship, and that really started emerging in the late 70s and early 80s. And at this point, there's now rules that the ABA has about clinical offerings, and all law schools offer some kind of clinic. Not all law schools offer animal law clinics. There's only a few, you'll hear about that. And not all law schools offer the same types of clinics, but all law school offers some type of clinical legal education. Is this me?
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, see, we did this together now. So most cases, clinical offerings are where students are admitted to practice as student attorneys or advocates. Sometimes the courts actually admit them. Sometimes they go into advocacy roles that aren't going to be appearing in court, but they're going to be doing lawyering things. It's a hand-on experience. And it's under the supervision, if they're admitted by a court, of licensed attorneys in the states. And so what students do is they earn credit while doing pro bono, free work for clients. With a few exceptions, there's a couple of clinical offerings where people do low bono cases, not in the animal law context, however. It's important to know that clinics are not just people going off and doing their own pro bono services. There's a strong classroom component. There's a strong clinical legal education. There's a large group of clinicians around the country and the world who think about how best to teach students how to become great lawyers. And so there's a classroom component that has these, and we'll talk a little more about what happens in the classroom a little later. But usually people do interview and counseling, representing clients, conducting writing, drafting legislation. My students actually do a lot of that. Investigating, analyzing facts, developing negotiation. So there's lots of things that you can do if you are a student attorney in a clinic.
And so we could talk a long time about clinics. We're really passionate about it, and we won't spend too much time getting really wonky about it. But a couple things that are important to note. In legal education, it's the only kind of professional education that does not require a lot of practical experience, right, while you're in school. And so that has changed somewhat recently that we require now a little bit. But for the longest time, lawyers aren't required to, go out and practice being lawyers, like doctors, nurses, dentists, architects, ministers, right, everyone else who's in a professional setting. We still think that we're not requiring enough. We also are a profession where our educators don't have training in education. And that's kind of problematic, right? So we think that just because you were a good lawyer, that means you'll be a good law professor. And I'm guessing everyone in the room has stories about how that may not be true. So the wonderful thing about clinical legal education is there's this rich jurisprudence now about teaching and about practice, right? So we have the theory and the practice and how to put those together in service of improving the profession, in service of preparing students to do the work that they want to do, right? Not what we want them to do, what they want to do, but to do it well, effectively, right? To do it ethically. And so we have that overlay added into our animal law component, right? So the animal law is sort of a niche within the clinical niche within legal education. So we have a lot to say. We'll kind of run through some of this kind of quickly. But one of the benefits is of clinics, in addition to teaching students, is they're learning laboratories. They're opportunities to slow down the pace of law school, slow down the pace of legal practice, and really think deeply, think reflectively, think hard about legal issues and what do we want to do about them. And animal law is perfect for that. Whether some of our students want to go on and practice in animal law, whether they just want to know about it, whether they want to do it full time, or whether they're not going to end up getting a job in animal law. To really think about the mechanism of law, right? How does it work? How does it interact in the world? What kind of consequences does it have? And what is the role of the attorney, right? What are their responsibilities to act and be actors in that stage, using the metaphor from yesterday, right? So this learning laboratory is a really rich environment that we try to take full advantage of. And as Kim said, we could talk, there's just hundreds of different styles, and we won't talk about all of them. But so this meld of theory and practice is really important. The idea that we're doing it pro bono is important. It's important because we're not tied to financial obligations. So when you're in a firm or when you work for someone, they're paying you to do a certain thing. And so you're bounded by some guidelines, right? Some parameters to serve that client's interests. We have that goal, but we don't have it tied to money, right? So when people say, oh, we really think we should sue this person or we should take on this matter, but we can't afford to do it, we can afford to do it. And that's a real privilege that we take very, very seriously. So we can handle matters that some nonprofits can't handle because of the financial consequences and so on. So we form these like little mini law firms within the law school. And the education, we have two primary goals, right? Our primary goals are educating our students and serving our clients, right? And so this is something we end up having to say sometimes we're not advocates. We're not creating advocacy for our students. We're not trying to tell them what to think, right? We're trying to teach them how to think, and they reach their own conclusions, right? So our advocacy is on behalf of our clients. So it's a learning by doing design. This reflectiveness is really important, and we can test all kinds of new theories and talk about strategies. It's also important to take into account adult learning theory. So another thing that Kim and I really do is we get into sort of neuroscience literature and the literature of education and how to teach people so that it works for them. Okay, so our goals really broadly, I've already said, right, we want to train legal advocates full stop, and especially animal legal advocates, because the work that we do requires some additional skills, right? We have some very specific areas of practice. So to serve the client's needs, generally we have a goal of ensuring that the interests of animals are taken into account in the legal system. Please don't look at the donuts right now. They'll be available for everyone soon. I'm looking at them too, so. So our method is clinical education, and our hope is that we create new realities for the animals, but also for students in ways that they can learn to practice. So this is just a slide that shows you what the landscape is. If we had done this talk 3.5 years ago, it would still just be me, which was lonely, and now there's a community, and it's really exciting. So we titled this like Clinics and Experiential Learning. Some folks in the clinic community have very bounded descriptions of what counts as a clinic, and they wouldn't include a couple of these because they're practicums and or more externship programs, but we like to be inclusive, and we want everybody sort of doing experiential work involved in talking with each other, because this is what is really important, we think, for students' education. Okay, so we're glad that that is a growing list, and we can talk about that more later. So the early clinics, we had a few clinics that weren't on that list that started. So we had Rutgers and Duke come to mind that didn't stay. And so these clinics are really a little bit of a challenge, right? To navigate the politics, navigate the costs, navigate the internal law school politics. And so we've had a few that have come and gone. And so we can talk later on about those barriers if people are interested. It's probably not something that's real relevant to what you're thinking about. There's really two ways to start a clinic, an animal law clinic in a law school, and that is to get external funding and bring it to the law school, or to have a faculty member, and so that's how the clinic at Lewis and Clark started, or to have a faculty member with tenure who has some autonomy, like Kim, who's already at the law school, who says, I want to take this work on. These are the sort of two models of creating these clinics. Okay. Why does this matter? Okay, so we think students need to be trained in general terms, but the work that we do in animal law is really sophisticated work. And so we need people who have spent some time thinking about how to engage in this arena, and this gives us an opportunity to do this. So they end up working with our clients who and they do it in a legal professional role. They also work with other professionals, both within the law and other disciplines, and that's really important. We think it's important to provide service to the community, and we think it's important to test these legal theories, as I said before. And so the students in the clinics, if they haven't already, really become a part of the legal community. Okay.
So I'm at a state school, which makes it kind of interesting to be doing something that's sometimes viewed as a little bit on the edge. But I had tenure, and let me tell you how my program started. Is a bunch of students, three, which in the world of animal law can be a bunch of students came to me and said, there's this new pro bono requirement that the state of New York has, and we'd like to do our pro bono requirement by doing animal law. Can you help us out? And me, being me, said, sure, I'm already teaching an overload, but why not? We'll figure this out. And so I created this thing called the Animal Law Pro Bono Project, which ran for about a year and a half. And we just found little projects that they could get their 50 hours. And we went out and we were doing some things. And then it kind of got bigger. And people kept staying. And then people in the community found out we were doing work. And people would come to me. And then all of a sudden I'm like, this is not a thing that I should count for my service time. I should create a course. So I had the opportunity to transition it into a clinic. Like standing right in the
That's
light.
how I ended up over here.
Sorry, I'm moving up
Blinded.
here. So am I doing something that's causing? Okay, sorry about that. So I created this, and of course I had a very generous dean who said, of course you can create an animal law clinic. You're the director of clinics, as long as you just teach it as extra. So I've been teaching it as extra all along because that's what I do, and I think that's important. But I think it's important to know that part of the thing of finding cost and faculty is that some of it, sometimes to make it happen, you just have to have a faculty who just wants to do it and will do it as something extra. So it's not a clinic, I describe it, especially as a state school, it's not a clinic that just does animal law, because animal law is a broad place. It's a clinic that creates business incorporation for all volunteer organizations. So we do other things. So that helps when I have alums and people questioning why I'm doing this with state-funded money. Like I'm generating some great experience. And so people come to us for all sorts of different things. We've created model contracts for animal adopters. We've drafted and lobbied a bunch of local laws to better protect animals, and we've created some model laws that have gone further. We've sought state law changes. We've worked with a collaboration to do some bigger law changes with other animal law clinics, and we've also had individuals who've been attacked using local laws that are outmoded when it comes to their vision of animals, and created situations where people who are trying to help animals were caught behind local laws. And so we've come in, and so I've ended up doing like minor criminal law litigation, which I've never viewed myself as somebody who would do criminal litigation in a clinic. So it's a clinic that just does what comes in. And I also will pivot to what's interesting to students. I had one student who was really interested in horses, and so we created a model adoption contract for New York so that horses were not able to be brought across the border very easily to Canada to have bad things happen to them in Canada. Not that is always happening in Canada, but it's easier to do that, to do some things with horse meat in Canada. So we did that. I also had a student recently who was really into migratory birds, and we're doing this migratory bird issue specifically because that student wanted us to do that. But to go back to Kathy's vision of what we're doing in clinics we are making sure that we are creating an opportunity for students to become lawyers. So we go into and we think about, what do we want people to leave the clinic with? So I have a description that I have that says that a student who leaves my clinic has had experience in direct advocacy in various fora, applied research, working with interdisciplinary professionals, client interview and counseling, fact investigation, drafting, teamwork, other profession-ready skills, experience relating deeply on the process and ethics of lawyering, and starting to develop professional identities. And so you can see we're doing the work for animals, but we're also doing intense work, which is why the term that I learned with Kathy, we're doing lawyering in slow motion so that we can do all this other stuff over here as well. And so there is the classroom component, and there's all the things that go into making this possible. Just a little bit about what our docket includes. So we work a lot with AVOs, all volunteer organizations in our area, and we've done everything from support for their direct work, helping with business formation. In fact, I have one student who wanted to do corporate work, couldn't find a clinic to do corporate work, is now at a huge firm in New York City who came in and did all this business formation work and created some of our templates and did all this great stuff. She has a dog, so she's like, I'll come to the animal law clinic because I like dogs, but not because she wanted to do animal law work. But she's now doing some pro bono animal law work because she saw what could happen when she was doing that, so we broadened her experience. We have contract work, especially creating models, as I mentioned, and support for large events, and doing all that kind of stuff. We work with our local SPCA. Some of the most interesting stuff we've done there has been on some of their cutting-edge wildlife matters, and looking at their contracts and legal work. The SPCA is an entity that can afford lawyers in certain situations, but can't afford lawyers for some of their other work, and so it's kind of a space where we are willing to do some things for a space that does have paid lawyers do some of their works if they get sued, but can't do some of their cutting-edge work to let them do some interesting stuff. We do coalition work. We will work with groups of people that come together on an issue. Trap, neuter, vaccinate, return for cats, for feral cats and community cats was one thing that we did in the beginning and have done for years. And individuals, as I said, who are facing court charges. We've done a bunch of other stuff that's been interesting that I can't tell you about because we have some confidential clients who don't want us to tell, and that's the rules of being in a clinic. One of the most interesting things that I've come to do recently is I got my certification, as Megan said, in restorative practices, and we've started really thinking about bringing ADR into the animal law world. If you haven't heard of restorative practices, ADR is often arbitration and mediation. Restorative practice is going into circles where the real focus is on the harm, and there's key decisions that are put into the hands of those who are most affected by the harm. It's not just the person who did the harm and the other person, but other people in the community, and makes justice healing and transformative, reducing the likelihood of future offenses or future harms, and people get involved in the process. There's a lot you can read about restorative practices. I think it's got a lot of things. I've got some materials if you want to read more about it. But it is a space where, as you can see here, the community members and the impacted party and the responsible party come together in a circle that is moderated by somebody who's very highly trained in that area. We actually have our students observe these rather than do the conferencing at this point, because I haven't had any students who's been formally gone through an intense conferencing. But we also talk a lot about the restorative practice continuum and using affective statements, affective questions, and really getting them into working with communities where there's a lot of discord to think this way creatively. And that's a blacked out picture, so you can't see the people, or faded picture, you can't see people, because we actually had what we believe is the first court-ordered restorative conference to deal with a criminal matter that was in court in animal law in the country that we facilitated and got through the process, which was amazing for our client, amazing for our students, and stopped something that had been going on for a couple of years. And so I'm really hopeful that this is going to be something that our clinic is going to continue to work on in the future.
Thanks. Try to position myself so I'm not with the sun straight in my eyes. And so, Kim, it's a good transition because the kinds of things that we can do again in clinics are things that not everybody has a chance to do, right? And we have the benefit of student resources, if you look at it that way, right? To do all kinds of really wonderful things. So ordinarily, when I start talking, if I'm introducing myself, and so I'm just calling this out because this is a transition to talking about Lewis and Clark. So I'll be talking about my clinic. Delsey's with us. I'm not going to chat about her clinic. Fran's with us. I'm not going to talk about hers. So I'll just talk a little bit about what I do. But if I introduce myself at Lewis and Clark now, our culture is evolving to say that we want to do a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that the land that we are sitting on and using comes from the people the indigenous people who were here before us, including the Clackamas, the Kalapuya, and other folk. And so I just want to call that out because as a good Lewis and Clark person, that's what I would ordinarily do. I would ordinarily do my pronouns too. I'm she, her, so just to round that circle. And so part of the reason I'm mentioning that is because it's part of learning. I'm still learning, right, about how to be a better lawyer, how to be a better professor, how to think about things and incorporate them into my work that enriches the work, right? And so the more holistically we approach this work, the better the work is. And so that's why I'm mentioning these things. So I won't go through a lot of the work that we do because I'm going to focus just on one area. So in my clinic, we do a little bit of everything. We do a little legislation, litigation, administrative work, policy work, and we train students to sort of have some exposure in all of those kinds of areas. So I have a few examples up here of the kinds of things that we've done. So we do both relatively what might be seen as mundane things in animal law. We do FOIA requests, we do white papers, we do administrative requests, we do just all kinds of things that are really good legal work for the students to learn how to do. And then we do what we think are some pretty deep dives, right? We work on things, and some are here. So we worked on the Tillicum case and the Justice amicus brief. So it was nice of Angela to mention me, but my students worked on that, right? And that's the important part. So we worked on 2 of the 4 matters that were on that slide about personhood, right? That have happened in the United States, which is pretty cool. And so we get to think about these things, and the students are coming from a different perspective even than I am, and my colleagues and our clients. And so all together, we have an awful lot richer perspective that we can bring to the conversation. And so these are just some of the matters that we've worked on. We work on a wide variety. But I'm going to spend time talking about AALI, which is our Aquatic Animal Law Initiative, because again, it's an example in the way that Kim's restorative justice example talks about something that hasn't happened before. It happened in the clinic, and because we have the privilege of the space of clinical education. So I had been going to lots of talks, and I kept saying, I wish when I did a talk on agriculture or on testing, somebody would give me the information about aquatic animals, because I know that's missing. And I kept looking for those resources. They weren't there, and finally we're like, okay, I guess maybe we should create some, right? We should really begin to focus on this whole. So about 3 years ago, we decided to do that. And when I say we, I mean, so that was my idea, but we did it in the clinic, right? So this was, we decided there was a need for a number of reasons for this focus, right? So because people aren't doing it, too little understanding means this policy decision making was poor policy decision making, right? If we don't understand all the factors in our decision making, we're not going well ahead. And nobody else was doing this work, so we decided to do it. And so we created the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative, and we created this mission statement. And again, when I say we, I mean me and the students. We took 2 class sessions. We talked about the name, we talked about what it means, creating the name, right? And all of the things that go behind that, so that it could enable us to do this work, right? To frame the organization. So not only were the students able to think deeply about what it is that we were trying to accomplish, they were able to have the experience of starting something from scratch. So when you leave law school and you want to start your own nonprofit, when you want to start your own project, what is the thinking you need to do to be successful? What's the groundwork? And we were able to do this slow motion practice, so 2 whole classes, which seems like a luxury, and it is, to spend time thinking about this. Okay, so very, very quickly, so I can't always count on people having talked about aquatic animals at a conference, but people have this time, so I'm gonna zip through this. So we sometimes, just as a reminder, again, for us, our students, and for other people, which animals we're talking about. And certainly there are other animals who are excluded, insects and amphibians, reptiles, but this is our focus right now. These categories, people don't think that aquatic animals are in all of these categories, are used, and used in really significant numbers. Apologies for my allergies, but they are, so I usually just put this slide up. Luckily, Dr. Franks has already talked about the science, so I'm not going to spend much time talking about it, except to say that the science is evolving to support the idea that, of course, these animals have all kinds of capacities that we have been overlooking. And so obviously the relevant part for us is that they're excluded from legal protection. The thing that I generally want folks to take away from this is sometimes they're not even mentioned in these laws. So their exclusion is assumed, right? So in a lot of our other areas, it's like, well, poultry are excluded, or we're only talking about mammals, right? But in some of these laws, their exclusion is just assumed, and that just shows you how much work we have to do to raise them to the visible level, to then have conversations about what appropriate regulation might be. Okay, so in the clinic, we took on a case that's here in Portland. So a national class action, consumer class action was filed against Petco and a number of other retailers, producers, and distributors of Betta fish tanks. And the concept is that these tanks were being sold, they were too small for permanent housing for these animals, which created adverse welfare conditions for them, which resulted in adverse consumer outcomes, right? So the consumers thought they were doing a good thing. They were buying these Betta fish tanks, but they were too small, so the fish were suffering and dying prematurely. And so this is a consumer class action that has been filed locally. So to our knowledge, it's the first civil lawsuit that ties animal welfare, right, to an adverse human outcome, right? So that in order for the humans to win, we have to prove that the animals are harmed, that their welfare is made poorer by the decisions of the companies. So this is also a good opportunity to synthesize law and science. So as Kim does, and my clinic does, and others do, we need to be working with other disciplines, again, as people have said in the panels going before us. So we think this is pretty exciting. We have settled with all of the parties, except Petco, and conversations are ongoing. But the nice thing to know about that is those entities agreed to change their behaviors. So they agreed to stop selling the small tanks, right? They agreed to, which is a really wonderful opportunity to have change, to also have a conversation in those communities, right? In the retail communities about what is appropriate, and that people are watching and are gonna hold them to account. So this has been a wonderful opportunity for our students. Okay, so that's the end of sort of just some overview about what we do, and we wanted to do kind of a quick exercise with you because
Can we just, are there any questions on
Thank you.
this before we move on to our exercise?
Alrighty.
Okay.
Okay, so part of what we do is sort of active learning, right? And so getting people, we're not gonna get you up, I do all kinds of exercises. Some of my students are here, or former students will tell you, I have people up and doing things all the time. But we want to just give you a sort of simple example. So this is something that I often do at the beginning of a course and say, to my students, what was your most recent experience with an animal? So we're gonna just ask people, you don't need to come up to the mic for this one. So what was your most recent experience with an animal? Can someone just holler something out? Walking here. Who's?
Ran into dogs on the way here.
So you saw dogs on your way here. Excellent, thank you. What else?
I fed my dog before I left.
Right, so feeding an animal before you leave. Excellent, thank you. Yes? Excellent. That was very nice of you. Excellent. Okay, what else? Yes? Very nice, right? And so part of the reason that we do this exercise is we sort of uncover some of the things, what are our expectations, what are our defaults. It sometimes takes a little while for people to think about the wild animals. So we default to our companion animals, the animals with whom we have a relationship. And sometimes it's like, oh, right. And so then if she said pigeons, and someone else might say squirrels, right? Or whatever you've seen, right? Other birds that you've seen on the way in, exactly. And so her realization actually opens the learning for other people, and it doesn't come top down from the teachers. And so this is really helpful, right? So that opens our minds to think about things a little bit differently. All right, so now we have the wild animals we saw on our way here. Anything more recent? Yes? FaceTiming your cat back home, that's awesome. Okay, good, good. And when I do this exercise, I usually do it with a group of students who are some animal law focused and some not, right? So it's kind of a mixed audience. And so then it gets like, okay, maybe there's something, is there current engagement with animals that people are having? So humans, right? That's really good. And so thinking about, we're leveling this hierarchy, right? So I don't like talking about the phylogenetic scale and that certain like fish are down here and insects. I just sort of don't like to accept that. I understand scientifically where it comes from, but I like the more, right, that seems very Cartesian and like the more sort of Darwinian, right? That we're all kin and have different relationships. And so it's really important to situate humans as animals along that scale. So thank you. Yeah. Uh-huh. I'm sorry. Right, and so And it's interesting, right? So when we ask people about their interaction, so some are very neutral in that we just saw a squirrel or a bird. Some are, I slept with an animal or I cared for an animal. And you can see that we're more in relationship with those animals. And that information informs how we look to those animals, how we think about them, and how we think about them legally, right? So this eventually leads to what we do legally. And so I also talk about, though, what's happening maybe right now. Are you in relationship or in an interaction with an animal in some way? And so I'll just skip kind of through this really quickly.
Because you would have had, and if we were a more mixed crowd, you would have had people who might get to meet on their own as well.
Right. And so we think about maybe what you ate for breakfast. And then we start thinking about maybe the healthcare or beauty care products that are on your body or the clothes that are on your body. And then to depersonalize it, we talk about, the glue that's probably in a rug or things that are in the paint. And part of that is to say we're all engaged, right, in interactions with animals we don't think about all the time. And so there's some level of complicity, right, which we have to own, but that's not the main point. The main point is if we don't think about it, if we don't see this as interactions with animals, then we can't be thinking about what are the policy and regulatory decisions we want to be making. And so this is just to raise it to the surface level, raise it to the conscious level, and to make it like we're all engaged in this, right? I am, we all are, right? So we can't get away from this. So it's not about blame, it's not about judgment. It's about we have to actually recognize facts, and then we can choose what we're going to work on. Helpful? And so this is just the kind of exercise that we do because it's more engaged learning. It's just an example of the kinds of things we do sometimes in the clinic. Yeah? Okay. Alrighty. So we're going to talk just a little bit more about sort of the kinds of things more generically that we do in the clinics. Do you want to start? Do you want me?
You start.
Okay. So the variety of substantive areas that we can do in clinics across the country is vast. So we're really not going to talk about the distinctions in that. We're also not going to talk about procedurally the different ways in which we engage in this work because, again, it's really vast. And we can wonk out on this, but you guys might get a little bored. But we did want to highlight professionalism, right? Because this is a really important part of the education that law schools do pretty badly at, right? So it's this transition from student to lawyer and thinking about what it is to be a professional. And as Russ Mead and others yesterday have so helpfully talked about, right, there's a lot that we need to think about specifically in our area of professionalism, right? Because our passion kind of gets in the way sometimes of thinking about the appropriate boxes that we need to be in as professionals. And so it's just a question of learning how to navigate that space, right? Raising, again, these issues to the conscious level for students and saying, yes, how do we harness that passion? How do we use that passion? How do we make it so you don't burn out? How do we make it so you don't cross ethical lines? How do we make it so you're serving your clients? And what do you do? And this is a space where we can have these conversations. When what your client wants to do for the animals is different than what you think is best to do for the animals. How do you handle that, right? And that's a conversation. That's not like, oh, we have an answer and we're done. That's a conversation, and that's something that people need to learn how to navigate, because that's going to continue to come up over and over. At what point do you sort of counsel your clients in a certain way? At what point do you say, this is what the client wants and this is my job, right? And there's a lot of space between those responses.
And that can be really interesting, an interesting moment for students, because people who come into the animal law clinic who are just really dedicated to animal law and who are facing for the first time a client that wants to do something that is so different than their moral compass ends up being a conversation that's very rich, that helps them situate themselves, because this is an animal law clinic is a space that they feel safe in for the first time in law school sometimes, and then all of a sudden they don't feel safe because they're having to proceed with something that feels really wrong to them. And so I have to tell you that there have been like tearful phone calls with students at 11 o'clock at night when they're like, I can't do this tomorrow. And we talk through why, and we talk through how, and we talk through, does it raise to the level of they have to pull out, or how can they do this, or how can they talk with the client? So it becomes a very rich space, and it happens almost every semester to certain students.
Right, and so clinic is a really great space to question our assumptions about all kinds of things, right? And so we tend to think, even in a space like this, that we all agree on things. Well, of course we don't, right? And so even in a class as small as 6 or 8 students or 12 or whatever it might be, those students come in with sometimes similar expectations. Oh, we're all in an animal clinic, so we all think X. and we don't. And so it's a really nice space to begin to think about. We don't, but we can still agree on other things, and we can still respect each other, and we can learn from each other. The other thing, because it's such an intense learning experience, students do not end up where they started, whether that's intellectually, professionally, personally, whatever. They're on a journey. We're all on journeys. So we still learn from our students. The students learn from each other, right? There's a lot that's going on. And our job is to make space for that, right? And to help the students become resilient so that their theories, their ideas can get tested and they can respond appropriately, right? And they can test others respectfully, right? And so that they can do that for one another as professionals, because our movement, our world needs that, right? We need to be able to do that. And so we have some very specific, we have general professionalism goals, but we have some very specific ones as well. Okay, so we just have a couple slides talking about things we want to really sort of highlight. So law reflecting values, this connection between human and non-human animal violence and oppression is something that comes up all the time.
And I just want to go, so in our clinic, we have a clinical program that does rounds between classes. And so one of the recent rounds was the animal law clinic meeting with the Family Violence and Women's Rights Clinic. And they came out together with a profound sense of what they're doing that's really similar, but also having really switched a little bit of their viewpoints on some of the stuff that they were hearing about that the other clinic students had been doing in our other spaces.
And we're lucky enough at Lewis and Clark to have a couple of other clinical programs we've worked with. We worked with the Small Business Legal Clinic, and we worked with the Victims Crime Clinic. And so these kinds of interdisciplinary opportunities within the academy are really important, but certainly we're trying to model that so that we can do it within the profession, because that's really important. So these things you probably pretty much know, so we're going to skip that. So I just want to talk about the power of students making a difference. And so this isn't actually a clinical story, but it's a shorter than our clinical story, and some of our stories have confidentiality stuff. So this one's a public one, I can tell. So some students, I think, come to law school and they get frustrated about what can they do, and the frustration is valid, right? Because the law is a very conservative, slow-moving instrument, and we can't always get done what it is we want to get done, and students sometimes have trouble thinking, how am I making a difference? And I don't want to wait 20 years to feel like I'm making a difference. So this is a happy story of a student who made a difference, right? So this student was a student at Lewis and Clark and wrote this article about the connection between, is what we were just saying, right? Animal violence and human violence. Got it published in a law journal, and it formed the basis of the first animal protective order in Maine in the United States. And there are now about 25, 26 states that allow animals to be included in domestic violence protective orders, right? And that came from the work this one student did. And it comes kind of full circle. So when I was testifying before the Alaska legislature to change their laws there so that animals could be included in the distribution of property upon divorce, this conversation came back up, right? So what is the realm of animals in this domestic space? And so we had this history we could rely on and talk about how nothing had gone crazy in the courts by allowing this, right? And so this next iteration, same thing, right? So this learning is iterative, right? And so just to share with you this, and it is 30, sorry now. Yeah, happy story, okay. So we want to talk a little bit about, so we're immersing students in a really intense learning situation, which can be intense no matter what the substance of the work is, and our work is really intense as well. And so when you combine that, we have to be really sensitive to the impact on our students. And so we've had the conversation yesterday, so I won't go into too much detail, but we just want to highlight a few things that are very particular, right? So students are traumatized not just because of what they're seeing, partly because, and this is really personal, they're recognizing their own complicity, right, in animal suffering. And that's a hard thing for people to recognize. And that's true for pretty much, and my clinic is very, very animal substantive focused, right? So it's pretty heavy in this. And students who come in as vegan and think, I've sort of made it to the top of the mountain, right? I've figured it all out, I'm doing things correctly, learn that maybe that's not the case, right? And other students who haven't come in with that learn what their engagement is. And again, this is not about, that's not my goal, is to sort of help them think about their engagement. My goal is to help them as they transition, as they learn those kinds of things and how it affects their professional behavior, right? And so we have to actually call it out. So I think at the very beginning I thought, well, I'm not going to talk about that because that's personal. And that doesn't work, right? So you have to support them, you have to recognize it, call it out, recognize we're all on a journey, we're all in different places on the spectrum, and give them support, right? And talk about, model what is supportive behavior. Yeah.
And I don't do it every semester, but I change up somewhat what I do. And there's some semesters that I bring in people from the social work school when it becomes apparent that it's really important for some of the students to have that support. In addition to some of the readings that I provide, I will bring somebody into class to make sure that there's care going on and that they're prepared to self-care and care for others as they emerge from this experience.
Exactly, right? And so again, as professionals, we need to, our profession, as was said yesterday, and we can't emphasize enough, we're not great at seeking help when we need it. We know we have high incidences of addiction and depression and things like that. So we need to help people figure out how to find resources and to do this work. Okay. So a couple things that are also special about animal law clinics, we've just listed a couple here, and we're gonna just go through, not all of these, but we've got a couple we've called out. So this concept of animals as our clients. Kim and I were trained in a very, very specific clinical methodology that was very sort of tightly bounded. But it formed sort of the basis of the clinical education jurisprudence, if you will, for a really long time. And this idea about giving autonomy to your clients, recognizing, seeing, respecting, and elevating your clients, really, really important, and it needed a lot of emphasis because it wasn't really well done in the legal field, right? So it was sort of still a top-down model. Lawyers tell clients what to do, right? And so we were kind of trying to flip that. So that was called the client-centered approach to lawyering. There are books written about it, and there's a lot of educational pedagogy. And so what does that mean when we are doing animal law work, right? So a lot of people say our clients are the animals. So what do you guys think about that? We'll talk really, really quickly. Are our clients the animals? How many people think clients are the animals? Okay. Anyone want to say anything about that? Thank you, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe in other situations, the person may be the client.
Right, so that's really, really helpful, right? So I think Matthew was sort of, I'm guessing, indicating the same kind of thing, right? So Tillicum, Justice, we're naming the animals and we're trying to center them within the legal conversation, right? We're trying, so the habeas cases, we're trying to make the animals be the clients. But absent those sort of rare cases, right? Our clients are the organizations working on behalf of the animals, right? And so this creates their agency, right, is mediated through those organizations, which gets us to, well, people can agree with what they do or disagree with what they do or strategies and all that kind of stuff we can talk about because we all have different ideas about what's best for the animals, and that's really challenging. So when we're talking about human beings, when we're talking about a child, we have some experts who say what's in the best interest of the child and they can interview the child and so forth, but we don't have that mechanism for clients. And so this is something we have to call to the forefront of our legal work all the time, right? So we have to actually recognize part of what we're doing is thinking about what do I think is best for animals? Well, who am I, right? What do I know about the dog or the orca or the chimpanzee or the fish or the manta ray, right? What information do I have? And so if I'm in a position to say something about what's in the best interest of the animals, I have to find out more information, right? This can't be about what I think. This has to be what some science gives us, right? It has to be some information that the law will recognize, right? And we can push the boundaries of that. We can talk about how law should recognize science better, how should incorporate science better. We need to still critique science. All of those things are still true. But we can't just go on our defaults as professional advocates, right? What is it that I think is best?
And I think that one of the things that I discovered, there are a lot of clinicians who say you have to name your files the same way and you have to do your organization of files my way from the beginning. I'm never like that. I'm like, as long as I can find them later, you can develop your own case names or you can develop your own matter names. And so a couple of years in, I noticed this group of students started naming things after the animal and then kind of throwing the organization we were working with. And so it was a really interesting switch. And so now, because the students did that, now I'm able to have a conversation with this generation of students about their naming because I hadn't done that. The students had done that, but I can talk about the role of just even giving a document or a matter a name, the power that has and how we pursue it. and that kind of thing. So it's a really interesting space to be in, and we can go in slow motion and we can spend the time talking about that, whereas I couldn't have when I was working, even when I was doing pro bono work in a big firm. I would never have had the time to kind of have that kind of conversation.
Right. And it's the kind of thing where you can make little successes, right? So you can name the document, say after the animal, and send it to your opposing attorney or to a court. And it's your document naming protocol, right? And they accept it, right? Because so there are little things you can do strategically, right, to open other people's eyes and sort of have them interrogate their assumptions as well. Okay, so we just want to sort of call out that we think animal law clinics in general should be sort of humane education, partly because the work we do is humane education, sort of benefiting our clients and society, but it should be done humanely. So we see also our role as responsible for the humane education of our students, right? So they should be treated humanely, and again, we recognize law school doesn't sort of always do that. So we want to be humanizing the legal practice, humanizing education, taking care of our students and our clients. So some of the frameworks that we do for this, so we need to see the animals as individuals, as members of species, as part of the environment, in relation to humans and in relation to others, right? So if we can keep all of that in our head, some of those things will have primacy in some instances and not in others, right? But if we sort of create these global and holistic frameworks, then our students can choose what they're using, when they're using it, and hopefully make those decisions somewhat consciously, right? Again, that's the goal.
Right. And I think that when we're thinking as professors and teachers how to do this, it switches with every group we get. So we have an overall outcome measures, and then some of these pedagogical questions, what should we teach and why? We have a framework that we have for that we've developed over our time, but then it modifies a little bit every single semester to make sure that we're getting what we need to the people and also serving the clients along the way. And so people are always like, give me your syllabus. And I'm like, well, I can give you a list of the memos that I'm going to do, but I don't know when I'm going to do cultural competence. I don't know when I'm going to do counseling a client, because I don't know what's going to be happening. So I can give you all of my memos and the readings that we do, but it doesn't come in a particular order because I don't know what's going to be happening at that particular moment in time. And how do I teach it? I do teach it similarly, but not the same way every time, because the context is different, the realities are different, and the students are different. So every single time, it's a little bit of a unique experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and just as a quick example, a year and a half ago, we took 2 classes between the fall and spring to talk about not just Me Too in the world, but Me Too in the AR movement, right? And so that takes place we did that in place of some of the other things that I was going to do, but these things evolve. Our clients need different things different semesters, our students do too. So we need to be responsive to that. And because we're working with adult learners, that helps, right? So if we're attentive to the educational sort of philosophy and information about working with adult learners, that helps us navigate this indeterminate space so that we can respond as flexibly as possible to the needs of the people who are in front of us. So we only have a few minutes, so we're going to just sort of zoom through a couple of things. So we just want to just talk about the part of our point is translating these ideas, these big ideas, legal ideas, into practice is what's really important, right? So this idea of practical philosophy or theoretical legal work is lovely, but without practical application, right, it's just lovely. And we want it to actually be meaningful. And so we're trying to navigate that space and join those two things. So we do that through this civic engagement and developing our educational tools. So we want to talk, we're going to slide into just a couple things at the end here, but we want to talk about different ways to think about clinics. So we're talking about this model, and some of you may say, well, I've already graduated from law school, or my law school doesn't have a clinic, or so it doesn't really matter to me. And so part of this is to think about why it might matter to you. So there's lots of ways for folks to engage with clinics. So you can be asking help from your local clinics. We go back to that list, right? There are clinics around you likely, and our clinics practice sort of nationally and even internationally. So you don't have to be located in the city where a clinic is to be seeking representation from that clinic. We also do consultation, right? So sometimes we just talk with people we don't even take on a full case, but we can help them understand who they need to talk to, where they can get resources to help them. So so students should be thinking about how to interact with clinics, starting one, if they don't have one, and we can help with that. The nonprofits who we help and who might need help, again, you can come and talk to us. Donors, a lot of this is donor funded, so yes, please come and talk to us. One of the things that we're trying to do is spread animal law beyond animal law people, right? So trying to get engagement with other academics so that people begin to see that animal law is present in their teaching areas. They can work with us in the clinics, or they can, adopt some of our methodologies into their work.
And that can happen, like literally there's I wouldn't call him curmudgeonly, but a person who's been teaching criminal law for years. And we were talking about something that I could talk publicly about that we were doing in the animal law clinic. And once he engaged, he said, blah, blah, blah. And then I heard a few weeks later that he kind of used an example in class that was related to what one of the students who was also in the clinic had noticed because they were in clinic. So you can just have these conversations in the hallways that can change things almost more than doing a luncheon presentation to your faculty members, just to kind of say, I'm doing things that are related to what you're doing. Let's talk. I'm not the weirdo animal rights person who doesn't wear leather and eats vegan food. Don't look at me as that. Look at me as the person who's also teaching the same students. And let's talk about where we can find some bridges.
And it's really important to help people know, just the way we're trying to train our students to recognize their professional responsibilities. We think our colleagues have academic responsibilities to take into account the evolving area of law that relates to property, torts, wills and trusts, criminal law, constitutional law. They're not doing their jobs fully if they're not addressing these areas, right? And this is cutting edge law, so the students love it. And it's interesting. It's not boring. It's never boring, right? So it's like, let us help you do your jobs better. And let us help you, courts, legislatures, and agencies, think about this. You have duties that you're not fulfilling. And so we need to help you think about, first of all, see that you're not fulfilling them, right? And so there are ways to, and then provide resources to help you do that. Ta-da, right? And hopefully hire our students so that we can do this more broadly. Okay, so we're winding down on time, so we just want to say that we think animal law education is really important, right? Obviously, you can tell we're passionate about it. We could talk for ages. But we think it's good for animals. We think it's good for nature and environment, good for humans in these ways. And so...
And I do want to say that I started by teaching an environmental clinic. And so I do want to say that, like, on Mondays, all my animal and environmental students get together for the main classes. And then we have the separate class meetings later. So they're connected, and we always do one thing together every semester. Last semester it was migratory birds. This semester it was an international treaty works that we were doing. So they always have one thing that all of them do in addition to their separate classroom components. And it is so that's one way that I make it manageable for me, but I also open some realms and make it seem not as weird as the term animal law is in Western New York, which is more like the Midwest than lots of other places.
Yes. So thank you. So we just think every step in the right direction. There's a lot of different paths, right? That's the other thing we tell students all the time. There's no one way to do this work, right? There's no one way to be a good lawyer. There's no one way to do animal law. So it's not about telling people, again, what to do. It's about how to do things, and that if you're moving in the right direction, that's a good thing. And so with that, we thank you. I think maybe, yeah. Yeah, so we finished. Yeah, we 15.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
As you can tell, I'm falling down on the job here. I was like, is it 10 or 10:15? So we have time for questions. We encourage people to come up here so that we can hear you, but don't let the fact that you have to make the long trek discourage you from doing it. So,
yeah, okay.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to have to stand because we can't see people standing at the microphone.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm a former student of Kathy, so thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation.
So we're former students together, okay.
I love all my students.
Yeah. And thank you also so much for the opportunity to really learn from clinicians, because it's so rare. I have two very practical questions. So I'm from France, and I've co-founded a clinical project, and it's, we're facing quite a lot of challenges because the concept of clinics is quite new, especially in France. And I have my first question is really about what we've experienced is that our clinical project is currently on hold, but it started living a life of its own. Because our students and ourselves really wanted to continue the work, and our clients really, continue to need our help. So I was wondering if you had similar experiences, and if there are any ethical issues that we should think about when we do that. And then my second question is, I'm also teaching to more professional students in a university that doesn't have a clinic. And my students have been practitioners before, and so they really expect practical teaching. And so I was wondering, when your law school doesn't have a clinic and you're teaching to that special crowd of students, do you have any advice on how to incorporate clinical teaching in a more traditional class, but with students who really have a huge level of expectation in terms of practice?
Yeah, so there's some really good resources actually on both. So there's sort of best practices in teaching, in legal teaching. So there's a couple of books that are useful. And so you can bring experiential. So I'm answering your second question first. Experiential teaching, practicum kinds of course design into other kinds of coursework, right? So there's lots of ways, and I think when Kim and I have taught even stand-up classes, we can't really help ourselves, right? We have to do something practical. So there's lots of ways to do that, from sort of simulated things, from real-life things that aren't tethered to a client, so you can cabin that for your ethical sort of perspectives, all the way to creating some relationship and being really careful about how that happens. So there's a continuum, a spectrum that you can use in those kinds of settings too. And I think Kim will probably echo this. Clinical work takes on a life of its own. We're super passionate about it. We feel ethically obligated to continue to do it, even when the students aren't there, even over summers and breaks. And so we get, I think, a little better at the front end of thinking about what the parameters of a relationship with a client should be, so that we can talk about those things and figure out what might happen and what we can sustainably and responsibly and professionally manage. And thinking about our role, because then the more we take on a role over breaks, it's harder for students to kind of come back in and take sort of first chair, if you will, on those kinds of things. So yeah, and this is going to the first question, right? So thinking about the life cycle of the work, one of the challenges in animal work, but also in clinical teaching in general, is there's no easy stop and start to these things. We can't say, oh, the semester's over, we're done. You guys will have to wait until the semester begins. It just doesn't work that way. And so whether it's litigation, legislation, any of our work, right, is a little indeterminate. And so trying to figure out how to kind of establish some boundaries, establish timelines, help both the students and the clients know what to expect up front, and then alter as you go as best you can. And we can talk later. Yeah, I'm sure Kim has additions.
We can give you some readings as well. I think you've gotten a really important, yay that you're doing this, and wow, we hear you. So come find us. Yeah.
And I think the other thing just to be really sensitive to is what we're talking about is within the U.S. legal education context, right? And so the training that students have to do after education and where they are in their educational arc is different in France and in other countries than in the U.S. So a lot of us, what we're saying is predicated on the U.S. model, but being sensitive to those distinctions. Yeah.
Great question, Alice.
Yeah, I've got. My question is one is funding. If you're not Harvard or Lewis and Clark, are there other means of funding? Could you just comment a little bit on that, where somebody might want to look and who the potential sources might be? The other question I've got is some of the bread and butter work of animal law is replevin, dangerous dog, custody battles, even malpractice. Do you ever get into any of that as well, and how do you manage that? I can't imagine doing that with students, to be honest with you, but and that's my question is, since that is where so many people start, in my particular job now, I am on the receiving end of law schools, and I know exactly what they cannot do. I'm sorry, but they cannot do when they come into the practice of law. So it's just an interesting thing to see what you can pull off in clinic work. So again, the funding and then the bread and butter stuff.
Do you want to start?
So funding is hard, and then the reason that I get to do mine is because I'm doing it as an overload and I'm already paid to do other things. But we have looked at, and there are some small foundations that will do things. There are some larger foundations that have done things, and so you get with some people who are good at that, and some people have gotten some individual donors to do that. So I think that it is hard, it is important, but it's place-based. I can talk to you about Western New York research that I've done, and I can talk to you about when I was in South Carolina, but I can't talk to you greater until I get into your space, because it is place-based research for the most part, unless you're going big.
And on the funding, I just want to add really quickly, both Harvard and Lewis and Clark are soft money funded. The schools aren't funding those clinics. Yeah, and so Yeah, and so it's interesting, right? So Lewis and Clark name has a certain draw, Harvard's name has a different kind of draw. And so when you're seeking funding, but it's actually challenging because most people think, wait, you want to ask us to pay to hire a professor to teach your students.
Right.
So that's a really weird ask, and most people assume that clinics are paid for by the law schools, because in most instances, that's true.
Right.
It's just lesser true in clinics, and still the majority of clinics are paid for by their law schools. Animal law clinics, that is just not the case. So we're real, so it's a very specific challenge. And one of the other challenges I'd say is you have to reach out to funders to say, okay, so first of all, we want you to fund in law, and that cuts away a whole bunch of people, and then legal education, and then animal law. And the people who care about funding animal issues care about, I want to see how many like dogs you've saved. And we're talking about, we're going to be training students who do animal law, who will help the animals, you know, sort of in the future. And so it's a really difficult funding challenge as a pitch, right? So you have to get people who are sort of in the community. So yeah, that was just my quick on funding.
And oftentimes, the place that I could start, think about starting is a local community foundation can help you with that as well.
Right.
With they're really good at that. As for case selection, I am especially careful in a state school about my case selection. Because my university president will hear about things that displease people, and for the most part he will take things. But I've made some pretty big selections not to do things that are really hard to do for students, and so I very carefully choose things that are not like you've asked for, to make sure that the students are going to be able to take the lead, keep the lead, and not feel like they're going to be chilled because of the nature of where they are, and that they're at a state school. So I am very clear about making sure that I've got them ready to do what I'm asking them to do in the clinic.
Right, and so because I have a year-long clinic, I can take on a different level of engagement, and so I have longer time to prepare students to do certain things. And again, place-based, right? So there are certain of the regular, we might say bread and butter kinds of animal law issues we don't take on here in Portland, because I have a lot of alums who are working in Portland and I don't want to take business away from them, right? So everyone has a different sort of metric in thinking about case selection, about what the students are capable of doing, what we're capable of preparing them to do, what the arc, the timeline, going back to Alice's question, like what can we do in the space and time we have available? All those kinds of things are come into play in our decision making. Yeah, really good question. So
Yes.
Thank you, Jane. And we've got about 6 minutes, so we probably
Oh,
have
good.
time for both of your questions.
And thank you for the presentation. I am a Lewis and Clark grad. I took an animal law seminar back in 2005 when there were only 2 animal law classes from Pam. And I've been a public defender here in Portland I was there for 8.5 years, and now I'm in private practice. And I do a mix of private cases and a lot of court appointed. And my question is, with regards to the clinic, I mean, and I know Jake Kamens, I've defended people accused of animal abuse. And so as part of the clinic teaching, is there any component with partnering with the public defender's office in learning how to defend a case? Because sometimes it's not, sometimes it's an education issue. It's not actually with regards to abuse. Sometimes it is a poverty issue. There are cultural components. And it's a question of working together with the prosecutor. Sometimes it's not like, oh, this person's completely not guilty, but it's a question of mitigation, education, and ensuring that it doesn't happen again, type of thing. And does that ever, is that
so 100%,
possibly
yeah, so what you're saying, we agree with 100%. So I'll say that one of my first students here in Portland went and did defense work. And we were actually pleased, and he was sort of on the opposite side of some, but I told him I was really pleased because he was gonna do a really good job with that case, and then when it went up to the appellate level, right, it was really well briefed, because there were Lewis and Clark alums on both sides of the case, which made me happy. So we reached out to, in handling dangerous dog cases, we saw what was happening here in the county, and I put together a mediation pilot project, and the idea was to sort of do what Kim was doing, and she can talk about hers a little bit more, but sort of a diversion, project. Let's talk about mediation, let's get people to the table, let's solve the actual problems, let's not think it's either killing the dog or doing nothing, right? There's a problem here, let's figure out what it is, how to remediate it, how to make sure it doesn't continue, how to educate the community not to have these things continue to happen. Sadly, there wasn't sort of funding, and there wasn't the political will for that project to be taken up here in the county, so I'll revisit that, maybe we can revisit it together. But yeah, and one of the things that we also think is really important in our teaching, as we said before, this is not dogma, it's not dogmatic, it's not like there's a certain way, and you're doing a really poor job of teaching if you're not talking about these other perspectives, right? If you're not talking about what the other side thinks and feels. I say in the clinic all the time, the farmers, right, and the people who do research are the rational actors. They love their kids, right? They're good people. Why do we disagree with them? What do we disagree about? How can we talk about that in a respectful and appropriate way, rather than demonizing?
Right, and I think that is really important. We operate as all of our law clinics are in one law firm, and so to take on cases on certain sides we'd be conflicted out from our firm, so we can't do that. On the other hand, students who want to do that, we can get them into externships in a different semester and get them to have that experience with people who are doing that. And I have done that for people who've done that. So they've been in my clinic and they've been in that side as well. So that's kind of how we manage that as a practicing law firm with multiple types of clinics.
And I'll also call out really quickly, so another Lewis Clark recent alum, Brittany, is working at ALDF in the criminal justice program, and she's trying to sort of navigate. She's got the space and time to think about navigating the space in that criminal. So it's not just like punish, 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 but think about it differently. And so there's some of that work is beginning to happen outside the schools as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Great question.
Hi, I'm a second-year law student at Syracuse University College of Law, and we don't have any animal law classes. We don't have any clinics. There's none. We're the only organization on campus that deals with it as the student chapter of the ALDF. Do you have any suggestions for how to kind of approach your administration with wanting these things to happen when it seems like they're a bit unwilling? Like how to pitch it almost?
Sure.
I would suggest not approaching an administration per se. I'd suggest finding a professor who would be an advocate. The administration is really looking at the bottom line of they're balancing things, and so taking it to having a champion who can easily get a meeting with the dean is somebody who's going to make it more helpful. And it's a hard time. It's a hard time for law schools to do new things that aren't championed by people who already have some level of power. So that's how I would suggest it. And also, like, Syracuse isn't that far away. Come visit in Buffalo. Come. We can figure something out. Call me. I'm actually not joking. We are actually in my environmental work. We are actually have a matter and a case in Syracuse. So we're not when we do that. So and that's another thing is when you're in a space you can't do it. Reach out. We can figure something out. You can come in by Zoom. You can come in once a month. I got you.
And I'll say really quickly, so the Animal Legal Defense Fund has resources to help students start classes as well as chapters. And it just depends on the culture of your school. So at Lewis and Clark, what we would tell people is actually have a student sort of petition and show that there's support and demand for this, because that will actually resonate with our administration. Our administration's more responsive to students than faculty, but it depends on what your situation is. And so if the power is with the faculty, then definitely, exactly. And you want a faculty member anyways who would say they'd be willing to be, help with this, right? And so if there are people who think about how to incorporate it in their classes, you also think about who's going to teach it. Because if you have at the ready, we have a grant from ALDF to pay an adjunct, here's the person who's qualified and willing to be an adjunct, and here's all the students who want it, here's the package, and you can sort of advocate in that way. So you can advocate for yourself by doing that work.
And here's the press release.
Exactly.
When you're at Syracuse, here's the press release. We pre-drafted that.
There you go. Yeah, thank you, and good luck, and holler if we can help.
Yes.
Thanks. And thank you to Kim and Kathy. It was fantastic. Gave everybody good food for thought, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.